Welcome to Investing Ahead podcast. I'm Tom Curran, co-CEO and founder of Curran Wealth Management. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us on this podcast, Investing Ahead. One of the most difficult things I've found over the years, both for myself and for my clients, is if I don't have money, how do I accumulate money? How do I make my money work for me instead of me working for money? And the truth is, most of us spend our lives working for money, dreaming and thinking about how we can make money work for us. Big dividend checks coming in, capital gains, that sort of thing. And it's always one of those things I think we have a tendency to put aside and say to ourselves, we'll get to it tomorrow. And I think that's what gets us into so much trouble. So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about some of the challenges I faced. And I have to admit that for me, money and investing was really a passion and something that energized me. It wasn't an afterthought. So I was I'm a little bit different in that I think we don't need any help spending money. We're all great consumers. We all have a list of those things we want and what we need to do to acquire them. I think a lot of us inadvertently save to spend. So many people I know, well, I'm saving. What for? Well, I'm for a car. I'm saving for this. I'm saving for that. But they're never really saving. It's really forced deferred spending because they don't have what they need now. So they save to spend. And that, of course, gets us nowhere. Let's look at things the way I looked at them when I was young. And I suspect many of you are looking at things the same way. I am 79 years old. I still recall somewhat vividly what my expectations were for when I became my age. But the truth is, I never thought I'd live to be 79. My mother died when she was in her late 50s. My father lived a little longer. My grandparents on my father's side died in their late 50s and early 60s. And a lot of my relatives were dying at similar ages. So I really did assume that I wouldn't live much beyond 65. And I'm not saying I planned that way, but I didn't expect to. And I think in my generation, it was somewhat common to think of retirement in a totally different way than we might think of it today. People today can expect to live into their 80s and into their 90s. That wasn't true that many years ago. When Social Security was initially signed by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the life expectancy was 65.3 years. Social Security kicked in just a few months before the life expectancy. There was no real expectation that people would live that long. It was, what if we live that long? Now we live in a world where we expect and really should count on living that long. Yet we still retire at age 65, and many Americans today retire at much younger ages, some because they want to, most because they have no choice. They become disabled in some way. Things that really aren't life-threatening can get in the way of working. So we need to be very, very conscious of each dollar that we spend today comes at the expense of the future. And it comes down to the consequences and how we see them. Back when I was born in 1945, my first job in 1970, roughly, after I'd graduated from college, I made approximately $6,000. Doesn't sound like much. It wasn't by today's standards, but it was $6,000. The maximum on Social Security back in those days that you paid payroll tax on was around that number. It was around $7,500, in that range, $8,000. And the rate was half what it is today. Today, people come out working for the first time, and that maximum that Social Security payroll taxes are charged is about $170,000 now, give or take a few $1,000s. How many people expect to make that much money to get maximum Social Security benefits? Because remember, you have to do that over a course of 30, 35 years. Not very many. How many people are ever going to make that much money, even adjusted for inflation? But certainly not right out of college, the way we were able to not that many years ago. So what does that mean? It means that we have to figure out a way to account for maybe 30 years of living where we never work another day in our life. There's no payroll. There's no income. Social Security, yes, hopefully. But most of that burden is going to be on individuals and how well they do from the time they begin to work at, let's say, age 20 or so, until they stop working at, let's say, age 65 or so. That's a long, long, long time to go without a paycheck. And I frankly don't think people really think about it very much. I think they worry about it, but they don't think about it. It's a little bit like a diet, I think. People go on diets, and they tend to go on crash diets where they want to lose a lot of weight in a short period of time. They want to see it. They want to see the benefit of it. And so we've all been on those diets. We go on the diet and we lose what we think is a fair amount of weight in the early months of it. And at some point we think we've reached our goal, and we go back to our old habits. And we go back to our old habits, and guess what happens? We put the weight back on, usually a few more pounds. Then we go on another diet, the same thing recurs. Investing's a lot like that, I think. There's a tendency for us to, well, I'm going to be good. I'm going to save. I'm going to invest. And it goes along, and we get to that point where an emergency came up, this came up, that came up, and we take the money and we're back to zero or near zero, or certainly at a number that doesn't appeal to us. So if I were counseling on dieting, I would say whatever we do, we need to do it for the rest of our lives. And unfortunately, the way we diet can't be sustained for the rest of our lives. It's too much. We want too much too fast. And at that rate, we can't sustain it, and there's probably no good reason to sustain it either. We need to adopt a way of losing weight, which is maintained over our entire lifetime. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Investing and saving is the same way. We have to do it for as long a time period as we can. And the only way we can really do that, unless we're already wealthy, rich, and then why would you listen to this podcast? You might just as well turn it off now. Most of us need to earn what it is we will have. The more we earn, the more we need to have when we retire. The less we earn, the less we need to have when we retire, because we're trying to maintain something at a much different level. But let's think about it for a minute. When I thought about investing many years ago, the traditional way we looked at it was you have to pay yourself first. And interestingly, I think a lot of people say the way they pay themselves first is buy something they don't really need in the first place. That's the way they kind of, we've taken away the word pay ourselves to reward ourselves. But in order to maintain and keep what we need, I think in terms of wealth to last us for those 10, 20, 30, 40 years that we're going to live after we retire, we have to figure out how to do it. and we have to figure out how to do it in a way that makes sense. The way that I try to look at it is every time we spend something, can we spend less for it than we pay for it? Let's think in terms of bigger purchases, like a car. Whatever it is we wish to buy in a car, could we get that car for 10% less? And the answer is, of course, yes, we can. So why don't we do that? So when we go to buy a car, instead of spending $40,000 or $50,000, why not spend $45,000 or $35,000? But the important thing is the balance needs to go somewhere where it can grow for us to take care of us when we no longer have income. You can even take something as small as a cup of coffee. You could buy a cup of coffee at a place like Starbucks and pay $3 for it, or you can buy it somewhere else and pay $1.50 for it. The problem we all face is we save to spend. And when we go to the store, how many of us have said, oh, I saved $30 on whatever. And what do we do with the savings? We tend to spend it on something else. We like to think that we save to make ends meet, but the question is, what are the ends? What are we trying to meet? If we measure everything in a present sense, I like to say the toe that I stub today always hurts more than the one I stubbed 10 years ago. And so we always look at the current event as we have to have it now. And the discipline that long-term investing requires, successful investing requires, is that we have to somehow come to grips with that. I really believe that we can all do that. I believe everyone can have a life that can be paid for and can be accomplished within the means and the wherewithal that we have on a day-to-day basis. If we live in a very modest way and we spend not as much as maybe other people may, we need less. If we spend more, we need a lot more. The power of compounding is a huge natural event that we all must understand. The power of compounding has been called magical by a lot of people. And what we have to think of is not the present value of our money, but its future value in two ways. If we can take $1,000 and save it, invest it, and we trust in the stock market in spite of its volatility, we know that the stock market has returned over many, many, many years 10% compounded. 10% compounded means you double your money every 7 years. If we keep our money safe and secure at, let's say, 2%, it takes 36 years to double our money. We don't have to be mathematical geniuses to figure that out. Here's the problem. If you go for the 10%, you have to accept the volatility. And you have to believe that this 10% will be recurring. And even though we may have financial crises, we may have pandemics, we may have lots of events, wars and other things that cause the market to decline, it is temporary. And when we stretch out the time period, 10%. That's a huge thing to consider. In the early days, 10%, 2%, it doesn't make very much difference when we have very little money, as I had no money at all when I started out, none. So if we grow our money at 10% in early years, 10% of $1,000 is hardly anything. 10% of $1 million is $100,000. And that's what we lose sight of, and we lose sight of and lose faith in the fact that we can all achieve bigger numbers than we suspect we can. And if you doubt for a minute what I'm saying, let's just think about what happens when you get to be 50 years old or 60 years old, and you've believed in that power of compounding and time and have enjoyed something approaching 8 or 10%. So now you come into your golden years of working, let's say. You're now 55 and you're looking at maybe you have $500,000 that you've put together over those years. Now, with that mindset, in 7 years, you're looking at $1 million. And then at age 67, you're looking at $2 million. And you may say, yeah, but I can't even get there. Okay, so let's look at $100,000 that you've put. And you've done it believing and trusting. Now the $100,000 at age 55 is $200,000 at age 62. And at age 69, all of a sudden, it's $400,000. And the bigger we can make these numbers, even if it's only 50,000, it can have powerful returns when we get there. But first, we have to believe it. We have to look at the history. We have to understand it. We have to understand that never losing any money at 2%, you'll never lose any money. But guess what? You're never going to make any money either, unless you've got a lot of money and you're already financially secure. That's simply looking at life realistically. So let's think about that for a minute too. If you earn 2% and the inflation rate is 3.5%, which is the average inflation rate over the last 120 years or so, you haven't made any money. You've lost purchasing power. Even if you've made 3.5%, you still haven't gotten anywhere for inflation. So when we look at the future value of money and what we will need when we get to that point in time, when we cannot work any longer for whatever reason, we need to get, at least in terms of planning, a rate of higher than 3.5 before we have real returns. So stop and think about that for a minute. If, for example, you had $1 million at age 21, and you invested it at 2%, never lost a dime, you will have lost money, though, over your lifetime. Remember, my income when I started was $5,000 or $6,000 a year. If I were coming out of college today, depending on my major and what I was doing, or out of high school, most college graduates today are making somewhere in the mid-50s to mid-60s, first job. Some make more, but generally it's in the mid-50s to 60s. So if I took that $5,000 back then and said, wow, that's equal to my income, and I put it in something paying 2%, it would have doubled to $10,000 over 32 years. Where would I be? I'd be nowhere. I'd be in the same kind of shape with 10 as I would have been at 5. We have to look at things that way. We have to not look at things the way we want them to be, and we don't have to speculate or wonder, but we have to stop denying and start getting realistic about it. And I think all good financial advisors need to speak that way. And I'm always reminded of what I was told a long time ago, that as a parent, the most difficult thing, I think maybe the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, has been raising my children, or 3 of them. One sadly predeceased, died at a young age, but 3 children. And someone told me a long time ago when I was raising them, they told me, Tom, it's a whole lot easier to give your children what they want than what it is to give them what they need. We have to give them what they need, not what they want. And I think sometimes we as adults don't understand that a lot of what we're maybe being told is what we want to hear and not what we need to hear. It's business friendly. I used to say, and still do say, financially, from a business point of view, I would have earned far more money giving my clients what they wanted than what I thought they needed. I've always erred on the side of what it is you need and not what it is you want, particularly around, typically, no one wants to lose money. We all want 10%, we all want 8%, but we don't want to lose money along the way. And I think that our industry, the financial industry, has done a remarkably good job of telling people they can get what they want in a way they want to receive it comfortably, and it can't be done. Stocks earn 10% over long periods of time, bonds 5% over long periods of time, and cash 2 to 3% over long periods of time. That's been the way it's been for a long time. I don't see any reason why that will change. And at Kern Wealth Management, in spite of the fact that I think we'd have more clients that would be in agreement with us, I think we tell them what they need to hear, and I think that our clients are far better off, and I think they would agree that they are far better off knowing what the real world is going to provide them with based on how they invest their money than what they would like to hear. Well, thank you very much for being part of this podcast today, and I hope to have you listen in the future. Thank you for watching.